You're listening to the Futures Podcast with me, Luke Robert Mason. On this show, we meet the scientists, technologists, artists, and philosophers working to imagine the sorts of developments that might dramatically alter what it means to be human. On this live streaming episode, we meet co-founder and former CEO of Kickstarter, Yancey Strickler. Now, to give you a quick idea of how this is going to run, I'll interview Yancey for about 45 minutes, followed by an audience Q&A. To help things run smoothly, all I ask is that you type your questions into the YouTube live chat when instructed. This will ensure that I don't miss your question. You can tweet about this event on the hashtag #FuturesPodcast, and feel free to share the link to this stream. And don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube account to get alerted to all of our future upcoming Futures Podcast episodes and events. Now, the modern world is defined by a value system that has narrowed into a money-obsessed condition. In his new book, This Could Be Our Future, a manifesto for a more generous world, Yancey Strickler argues that our focus on maximizing financial gain has led to a short-term decision-making that prioritizes what we want and what we need right now. This is fast becoming disruptive to society, but it doesn't have to be this way. By giving a greater consideration to our future selves, the people who rely on us, and the next generation, we can all find ways to create a new society focused on abundance for all. So Yancey, I want to kick off by asking you, I guess, the obvious question: why decide to write not just a book, but a manifesto?
It's a great question. It sort of found me, I think, more than I sought it out. My life before Kickstarter was that I was a music critic, a music journalist, and my whole life, all I really cared about was writing. Becoming an entrepreneur was like an unexpected sidetrack. I stepped down as the CEO of Kickstarter almost 3 years ago and wasn't sure what the next project was going to be. But during the last few years at Kickstarter, we had spent a lot of time thinking about the macroeconomic climate that the company resided in. And this led us to become a public benefit corporation, to reclassify Kickstarter from a classic for-profit corporation to a public benefit corporation, which is a legal structure in the United States, where I live, where a company must balance shareholder value with producing a positive benefit to society. And this is a legal standard. And that move was a long time coming for us, and led us to do a lot to research and better understand what these expectations were for for-profit companies. And for us, kind of artists and accidental entrepreneurs who turned into, founders of an important tech company, seeing that water that we swam in, feeling how different our own value system was from it, just made me very aware of the incentive structure that companies live within, that most startups and for-profit companies live inside of. And now, even if you're someone, say like me and like a lot of people who are trying to do, quote unquote, the right thing, it's quite difficult. And the systems are kind of optimized for very specific outcomes. And the outcome over and over that dominates is whichever choice produces the most money. And so the litmus test, the secret code that runs the world is that the right answer in any decision is whichever option makes the most money. And if you just sort of like apply that lens to how the world operates, the world starts to seem a lot more rational. A lot of the ways that regular people are screwed are extremely profitable. Forcing people to raise their incomes through debt rather than through paying them more money increases the money supply, and you get interest on that money after the fact. There's all sorts of ways that it makes sense if you just imagine that the end result of every decision is someone making more money than they would in another path. And so, I wanted to understand the history of that idea. And I wanted to understand the sort of the philosophical underpinnings of it. And I felt that through Kickstarter, both what the company did and how we approached the structure of the company, it was obvious to me that there were other paths available. And the notion that all options funnel down to this one way, that all ideas must be optimized for profit maximization, that's just absurd, that's just simply the first and most powerful funnel that exists, but it's not going to be the last one. And so even our shift to becoming a PBC and even the notion of crowdfunding, where ideas are being supported not for financial self-interest, not for selfish, rational, quote unquote, rational reasons, but to help someone, to be a part of something for all sorts of other valid reasons, other values that are also real and that also drive human behavior and that get lost in a profit-dominated world. So, I was motivated by my own personal experience and also just a real belief that these are all things that are changeable, because this ideology entered the bloodstream more recently than we think. Many of us have watched this change happen in our lifetimes, which says that this change in this world that we live in is impermanent, and it can evolve somewhere else, especially if we have a conscious vision of what that somewhere else should be.
So that idea of financial maximization, I mean, that's really the problem that's at the core of this book. And I just wonder, how does this idea of financial maximization, how does it really encompass the entire predicament we find ourselves in society today?
Well, to me, it's the reason, the way I talk about being made aware of it was I used to live in New York City, lived in New York for 20 years. And in the Lower East Side where I lived, there was an old place called Mars Bar. It was a punk dive bar that had been there forever. And one day it got torn down and it got replaced by a new bank, a TD bank, a bank branch. And at the time, there were already 3 other branches of this exact same bank within a 15-minute walk of that same corner. And I lived right around the corner from it and couldn't understand how this was happening. It was like there was this virus infecting the neighborhood overnight, just flipping storefronts into chains, and learned that more than 1,000 bank branches opened across New York City over those years, shutting down local businesses. So, what is the justification for this? I, as someone who lives in the neighborhood, I probably lose out in that situation. Mom and pop shops closing is a net negative for the neighborhood. So what is the justification? Well, the justification is real estate speculation. The justification is large mortgage payments that have to be remade, and those get forced on smaller businesses who can't remake it. And then it eventually swifts over to chains who can pay that amount of money. And that basically that the reason why certain things die and certain things survive, the reason why entrepreneurship has shrunk and the market caps of companies have risen is because everything's operating according to this philosophy, which is just simply trying to amass economic power, using that economic power to change the rules in your favor, to encourage more of a monopolistic environment, and to just more and more secure market share, secure mind share. And in the book, I show how this is a process that really began in the early 1970s with the financialization of the economy. But you could see the cultural change. And that's what I think is really profound. I show a study that UCLA here in the United States has done for about 50 years, where every year they interview incoming college freshmen, so 18, 19-year-olds, and ask them about their goals in life. And one of the goals in life has to do with money, being well off financially. And in 1970, the percentage of college freshmen who said being rich was essential or very important was just 28%. The most important life goal that year, 1970, was to, quote, develop a meaningful philosophy on life, with 84% of college students saying that was essential or very important. The most recent year this study came out, in 2017, the percentage of college freshmen who said being rich was essential or very important was 82%. The percentage who said having a meaningful philosophy on life was less than half. And if you chart all 15 values that are being asked each year, the growth of the belief in being rich is by far the biggest change. The desire to become an artist, the desire to have a family, the desire to excel at your career, all those things are fairly constant. But this belief in wealth has really grown. And so I think the value system of society shifted from moral values, beliefs of what is right and wrong, to economic value, to something that is tradable, that's ownable, that's universal, and that is exploitable and gives power, gives individual power, reinforces an individualistic culture. And so to me, that has been the shift, is sort of the power of humanistic values. Those things have all shifted to economic value, and we're relying on price and money to basically be the proxy for everything else. And we've been told that if we do that long enough and in every way, it will eventually work itself out. The prices, the markets will settle things out. But we're 50 years into this experiment.
I mean,
and yeah.
But partly, you mentioned the 1970s, but partly, wasn't it the Rand Corporation and the emergence of game theory that really forced this idea of how we should build businesses and how we should build society?
Yeah, I mean, game theory. Game theory was really important for a couple of reasons. I mean, this was developed at the Rand Corporation after World War II, sort of to strategize for the Cold War. And game theory is just simply a mathematical process that lets you see basically every potential outcome, and outcomes on outcomes, how events might chain. The challenge with game theory is that it presumes that for a large swath of it, it presumes that interactions are competitive, are not cooperative, that interactions are zero sum, and that basically what game theory nets out is that the rational desire for an individual in any sort of scenario is to maximize their personal self-interest. And this is where you get things like prisoner's dilemma, where you're taught that the rational choice for your self-interest is to rat out a friend because that's what satisfies your immediate needs. And so this, which is like a extremely valid mathematical concept, got applied more broadly as a philosophical defense of individualism and of the idea that the notion that we have shared responsibilities is a fiction. And that's something that they're just telling you to do to try to control you. But in reality, we are all individuals and we have no responsibility for anyone or anything else. This is what Thatcher represented. This is a lot of the personal responsibility movement is really about, it's all about the individual and there is no collective obligation. But really that mindset is about freeing those who have resources from having any obligation. It's trying to negate that cultural value of looking out for your neighbor. So the way I've come to visualize it, in tech we have like tech stacks of you have your database, you have your back-end architecture, your front-end architecture, and then finally your graphic interface for end user. I think values function the same way, where at the bottom layer, at the database level, there's like cultural and moral values and beliefs, the things that you believe are right and wrong that are unique to you and your society. But built on top of those cultural values are rules and laws and norms. So laws are an expression of our cultural beliefs. The reason why we say certain things are right and wrong is a reflection of some deeper moral core. And then finally, built on top of those rules and laws are metrics and incentives. How do we measure the outcomes of our expressions of value? And so each of these sort of layers onto the next. So it's like moral, cultural, rules on top of that, and metrics and incentives on top of that. What's happened over the past 40 years is that the incentive layer, which today is money, has gotten all the power. Incentives are being used to rewrite the rules. The rules are being used to reset cultural values. And instead of being a society oriented from a moral, cultural value space and building on top of that, we become a society rooted on an incentive layer and sort of reverse engineering our world around that. So to me, the challenge then is how do you change that cultural, moral level at the deepest root level, right? Because if you change at the root level, then other things start to build and cascade from there. And so the theory I come up with in the book, which is about expanding how we define self-interest and expanding as a result how we define value, to me is that kind of cultural moral change where it's like our sense of obligation changes from just now individuality, immediate short-term individualism, which I think is the religion of the West today, to something that is more actively aware. And I think if you look at history, you could argue that human history has been a progression of consciousness, a raising of consciousness. And to me, the next logical extension of consciousness is to the network, is to each other. Like that is a reflection of how the technology is changing us. And as something like what we're going through now shows us, it's also just true that we do have tremendous influence on one another. So I think that there's these are all just like visualizations, kind of a UI to imagine what is a very complicated process that, of course, I'm giving, just minor, speaking about it in such trivial ways. But I think something like that is what has changed. And I think that is how it changes again.
I mean, to a degree, all of that has led us to define value through these very simple things. In the West, it's across the world, in fact, it's the idea of GDP. We use GDP as the only effective measure of value. But as you say in the book, in actual fact, GDP is a very ineffective way to measure value.
Yeah, it's a great proxy for the things it's meant to measure. It certainly has wealth has a relationship to other traits and qualities, but the notion that you aim for something that is at best possibly a distant proxy of what is actually important, I think is problematic. This is where you're seeing the paradigm shift beginning to happen with New Zealand, Iceland, Finland and Scotland all shifting to national governments oriented around well-being, human well-being, trying to numerically and mathematically define what that is, to define the spheres of well-being that the state must think about, the spheres that markets will think about. To me, that is like absolutely the right kind of change coming. Also, Amsterdam shifting to Kate Raworth's donut economics for how it's orienting its city government. All these are states led by women who are embracing what to me is a more actively aware, more holistic notion of value and of self. And it's to me, it's a progression because it's not refuting the importance of GDP. It's not refuting the importance of wealth. It's yes-anding it. It's building on top of it, right? History is building on top of. History is not revolutions and ripping off the last thing and replacing with something new. Generally, we build on top of what's there. And so the reason why I think this progression of an expansion of self-interest and an expansion of value is the right kind of path is because it is still a progressive one. Like we are still growing. We're just learning to grow different types of value rather than only financial value. So it's still letting us have that target to work towards. So I think that there is a widespread feeling, really because of how exaggerated the past 20 years have been economically. There's a much stronger feeling that there's a need for a shift, that the anomalies of the system that we are in have added up for too long. And so you see people willing to take a chance. And what's exciting about this is that the technological moment that we're in, with the amount of data, things we're able to measure, the amount of sort of ways that we interact with one another, we're able to better see and perceive, makes the embrace of new forms of value or the measurement of new kinds of interactions possible for the first time ever, right? At any other point in history, how would you possibly measure things like this? Or how would you define, you would have a month-long Socratic dialogues about what loyalty means. Today, loyalty is maybe something that a team spends a year trying to create the right algorithm to try to identify a loyal interaction when they see one, right? And so I think that is sort of like where we are now and how technology and value are going to interact. And I believe that what it will eventually produce is something that we may grow to call post-capitalism, where we are creating transactions, greenlighting projects based on the growth of values on top of financial value. So projects will have to meet some financial minimum, but really they're optimizing for a community benefit or a sustainability benefit or some pro-social benefit. And that this will be something that we'll be able to do intelligently, rationally. It won't be like a political choice. It will be something that we can all see is value creating.
So I guess what are some of those values that you think we should actually prioritize instead of just purely money and finance? What would you actually like us to see prioritize? Yeah,
well, the ones I would think about are fairness. I think fairness is a really interesting thing to think about, like to try to calculate the fairness of systems. Because I think fairness, if you try to think about the, say, distribution of social goods from a perspective of fairness, it gets into a lot of interesting questions about deservability. I think you get into like interesting reverse Dutch auctions of like need with ability to pay. But I think fairness is one that's important to think about. Certainly the sustainability of our practices. If there's sort of a language that we develop to know for how long we can continue doing something that we're doing. I think sense of like consistently working towards something. To me, one of the hardest things as an individual or as a company, you can know where you want to go, but how do you consistently make choices in that direction over time? Some way of like guiding you towards that end. I think awareness is something that's interesting. I mean, like the ability for us to understand how much we are perceiving or not perceiving. But in the book, the example that I write about that is being used today, and I think is the type of like very specific application, is Adele distributing concert tickets using a loyalty algorithm. So Adele trying to break scalpers reselling tickets for hundreds of thousands of dollars more, and using an algorithm that would approximate how loyal a fan was to her as an artist, and to distribute tickets based on like the top percentile in each market. There's a dystopian version of this, which is like the Chinese social credit system, where like you don't get into a restaurant or something unless your loyalty or whatever score is so high. There's a utopian version of this, which is that Adele created a post-capitalist transaction that solves a financial minimum and then optimizes for a non-financial maximum on top of that. And in that way, it's not an altruistic choice. It is a value maximizing choice, but just with a different framework of value that we currently think of it. So I think that there are a couple other examples that have happened recently. I mean, one was in the US, the people that provide the SATs, which is a standardized test anyone going to college takes. They had built an algorithm to try to produce a hardship score, where they would analyze a student's background to sort of like, change their score based on their personal hardship. To me, that was like a fascinating attempt to do this. And so you're seeing that kind of thing of like, how do we measure these sort of social interactions that we have? I don't know if it'll ever get to be so clear of like a Pitchfork album score. We're like, whoa, this is a 9.1. I should check this out or whatever. But I think that we will get to a notion of what is harmful and what is helpful to different spaces of value. That a bank going into a neighborhood and say replacing a local grocer could be judged as a net negative when viewed from a wider set of value perspectives than who can pay the most rent.
I mean, the great thing about you, Yancey, is you've had first-hand experiences of trying to get people to rethink what they value. And the example of that is Kickstarter. I mean, in what way did the formation of Kickstarter and all the lessons you learnt whilst building and running Kickstarter contribute to the central thesis in this book?
Tremendously. I mean, kind of the core conceit of Kickstarter from the very beginning. It was Perry Chen that first had the idea for Kickstarter, and when we started working on it, we were focused on Perry had the idea for crowdfunding, and we started thinking about how this would work for creative projects, because that's the world that we both came from. And it was just so obvious that in the world of the early 2000s, if you were a filmmaker or a musician or a writer, you're going to a book publisher, a record label, a film studio, a giant corporation, and you're trying to convince them that you're going to be a hit, that them putting money into your project will make them money. And you go into that room and you're looking to sell them on that fact, and you're willing to like contort your idea to meet their expectations. This is what you're expected to do as an artist. If you don't do that, then you're screwed. If you don't do that, then you have to rely on personal wealth, or you go into debt, or it just takes you a really long time to do anything. So we were very struck by the notion that the whole creative industry functioned on this idea that the only good ideas were profitable ones, were ones that were likely to be profitable. And that system didn't even perform that well to begin with either. I mean, it had plenty of misses. And so the notion of Kickstarter was, if you provide a place where people can contribute to an idea, and there is no hope of financial upside, because from the very beginning we said, if you put money into a project, you don't get money in return. You get a copy of what's made. You get to be a part of it. You get a social credit, but you don't get a financial credit. That people will still do that. And in fact, a greater diversity of projects and ideas will be funded if the reasons for funding encompass a broader swath of possible reasons other than just financial motives. So on Kickstarter, a project is funded because the neighborhood needs it, because it's a cool tech and people who know technology think it's rad, because the creator is cute, because they did good things in the past, because they've earned some loyalty. It's a multitude of reasons, none of which are financial upside. And so through that, $5 billion almost has changed hands for irrational projects from any economic perspective, 150,000 ideas, funded without, in a way that completely breaks the traditional economic paradigm of why money should change hands. And so to me, that really showed, number one, that the reasons for acting are far broader than we think, and that creating space for other reasons for action is like incredibly beneficial. Just a lot of different things can happen. And number two, the experience I had of watching the world react to Kickstarter and watching this idea become something that people really believed in was really eye-opening to me, because I kept waiting for like some group of suits and a clipboard to come by and knock on our door and just like check that we met all the standards for like changing things. I kept waiting for like the people in charge to say, all right, you're good. Here's your green stamp. And the fact that the platform and the idea had such a effect, honestly really scared me at first, because it made me realize that probably meant most things were as changeable as this had been. And that most things had probably come to be in a similar way our thing had been. And I suddenly felt like the world was less stable than I thought it was.
I mean,
but yeah,
what you were doing with Kickstarter is you challenged the status quo, and there's so many challenges that come with challenging the status quo. And I just wonder, I mean, how did people look at you back then when you suggested this new model, and how in the end did you manage to convince them?
Well, creative people, artists, almost always got it. You would talk to someone who's an artist, you're like, listen, you can go straight to your fans instead of going to your label. Artists would be immediately like, yeah, totally. I mean, the first and most of the first investors in Kickstarter were artists who we would pitch the idea, and then some of them had done well enough that they're like, whoa, do you want help doing this? People who came from the business side, their reaction would always be, so I get a piece, right? Like if I put 20 grand into, whatever movie, I get a piece. Like if it's a blockbuster, I get a cut. And we would explain, no, like that was not the intention. And that just like made zero sense. And so there was just artists understood it. Fans understood it, right? Like I knew I would give whatever amount of money to David Lynch to do whatever he wanted, and I would be thrilled to do that. I would be thrilled. But for people that didn't come from the art world, the mindset was more like, someone once said, like, isn't there already too much art in the world? And so there is that kind of mindset. But what was amazing is that once it was out in public, it didn't like immediately take off. It was like a slow build, but it was immediately validated by creative people looking at this and saying, yes, this is that thing I needed. This is the way I can do that project that's going to cost $6,000 to do. That like, no way am I going to like put that on my credit card. It's a lot of money. That's like 3 months rent. It's hard for me to do that, but I also think it would be awesome. I wish I could do it. Right. So there was it created this door where it ends up there. It always needed to be a door, but no one realized it. And so, and there it just got very methodically validated. And once it was out in the public, no one was asking for that financial upside, right? Like that conversation disappeared. That conversation only existed with trying to get money from people who have money. And so it's those demands of those people that then inch their way into a startup and then inch their way down to a user that then create, predatory terms of use. It starts at such a high level. It starts at that moral, cultural level, right? And it just reaches all the way down and through.
I mean, I have to think of the example of Oculus Rift and what happened when they sold to Facebook, because then that entire model was questioned. You were so successful in challenging the status quo, and then suddenly this Kickstarter funded project gets bought by a large corporation like Facebook, and it feels like everybody has a little chip on their shoulder over the fact that they didn't get a cut over the billions of dollars that sold to Facebook. And what we began to see was us reverting back to those old value systems yet again. And I think in the US you had, and correct me if I'm wrong, you had something called regulation or Reg A, which was going to argue for the fact that people could put in small bits of money and get small bits of the company. So do you feel that was the sort of the old system pushing back on Kickstarter, that you were almost there with challenging the status quo, and yet the status quo again challenged you?
Yeah, it was hard. Oculus, when Oculus went up on Kickstarter, Palmer Luckey, the creator, I mean, he was literally a teenager in his garage. It was like a demo, and the video was just all these great gamer people being like, I just tried this, holy shit. It was awesome. And then he built the technology that lived up to that. And then the Facebook acquisition was very challenging, right? It was challenging to the value system. And it was hard because, we would never ask anyone to bind themselves to certain terms by using Kickstarter, because that's like, even if those terms said you can't revert to the old game, because even if you set any restrictions, it is still kind of the old game. Maybe the opportunity there would have been for Oculus and Facebook to have found a way to acknowledge that, right? Where maybe you say, we get that legally this existed in a different kind of way, but we know that from a social perspective and the way that people feel about Oculus and how important this community has been to Oculus, we're going to try to do this other step. I mean, that was there for them. Knowing the Oculus founders, I'm sure that they would have liked for that to happen. But you're talking about Facebook and a giant public traded company. But yeah, that's a weird moment that definitely puts that, it's a clash of those value systems, right? And it shows you which value system is more powerful. It's the one that writes the checks that still ultimately has that power. But that's changing, right? Because it's a small thing, but I saw the video last week of the 17-year-old kid who's running the biggest COVID-19 website database thing, and the fact that he's refusing to put any ads up, right? There's still this don't sell out mindset that exists. That's certainly a part of Kickstarter's ethos and comes from our background in the music industry and the creative industries. But yeah, the Oculus moment was tough. There is equity crowdfunding in the US. There's a lot more of it in the UK, and it's been much more successful in the UK than the US. But generally here, the projects going out looking for money on those platforms are, just tend to not be the most attractive kinds of investments. There's community-oriented projects I think are great, but I think the notion that this could be the great democratizer to where you could be the angel investor in Facebook, which is what people were sort of promising, I think that's unlikely to happen. And to me, more than just continuing to expand the application of the existing paradigm of how money should be used, which is money should be used to maximize more money, that instead the more interesting move is to justify the use of money for new reasons. So basically, to me, I think the pivot that's beginning to happen now, and we're seeing it with the funding into vaccine research, is to see investing financial resources into the production or growth of non-financial values is rational. And it's something that should be done. And that only using money to further create more money is a very limited notion of the use of a very useful tool. But yet we trapped ourselves to where the only good ideas, like the world of creative projects before Kickstarter, the only good ideas are ones that can beat the S&P annualized return. Yeah. Right? There's still that invisible litmus test. That's why PPE material wasn't being made fast enough, right? It just wasn't quite profitable enough. So you need these other value systems, you need these other orientations to drive behavior that just that profit orientation isn't going to speak to.
Do you think in that case it's sometimes less about challenging our definition of value and instead challenging our definition of success, because in so many ways success is very much tied to the financial wealth and gaining financial resources. So do you think we should start with how we look at success in the world before we start looking at value?
Yeah, well, I think those things are very tied, because I think that behavior role models do a tremendous amount to shift behavior. I feel like I watched. It's a minor moment, but I feel like I watched as like the cultural role model moved from Julian Casablancas of the Strokes to Mark Zuckerberg. Right, there is this moment where it's like the height of culture is to be a creative person who doesn't give a fuck. Right, that's like the Strokes, and then the height of culture becomes to be a business person who doesn't give a fuck, but who also makes lots and lots of money. So I think that these role models do a lot. They sort of like draw a bullseye on the board. If I look at the growth of the belief in being wealthy, I think you see a shift in those cultural values. But I think that is changing, right? Like in that same UCLA poll over the last few years, there's been an emerging answer, which is of like what's important, and that's to quote, be a values entrepreneur, which is their term they use for someone who's just trying to shift values through, whether that's through activism or starting a nonprofit or whatever it is that they want to do. But that is something that is starting to enter the scene. But yeah, I think that success equaling being rich is like a loud message that exists in the world today. I think the more apt message is success equals probably secure and self-coherent, secure and living in integrity with who you are and where you are in life. That it is possible for all of us to achieve that without really asking anything of each other. We can do that in a way that's purely giving. And that there is a sort of us chasing this moving target of reaching a level of financial satisfaction, which will never happen in the way that we want it to. That's a dead end street, right? That leads nowhere. Even for the richest person in the world, they look at their money as like, all this money still needs to earn at least 10% this year, right? This money doesn't count. It's all still about like the compounding yet to come. And so, I think we just tied ourselves in this strange knot. But new kinds of voices are rising. There's definitely a new rise of like solidarity, the concept of solidarity among young people. I think like COVID is, sort of plays more into those kinds of emotions and feelings. So I feel like we've already had the peak of individualism, near-term individualism. I think that we're in the crumbling of that empire at the moment. And that we're shifting to something more like post-individualism, where, yes, it's incredibly important that we're all individuals, that we all have something special about us. At the same time, the fact that we're all individuals and that we all have something special about us makes that less important. And so we can both celebrate our individuality and celebrate our shared traits. I think that is like a post-individualism, where it's not trying to put back in the box the fact that we're all unique. It's just saying, yeah, but that's not the greatest thing. Like, it doesn't stop there, right? And the same thing with the shift of post-capitalism, the notion of financial value being the only value, that everything must be pegged to that if we maximize that one value set and then translate everything after the fact, it will work. Instead, we're going to shift to post-capitalism, where we acknowledge that the spectrum of value sets that we should be building is larger than just financial value. Financial value is absolutely critically important, but there are probably 4 or 5 others that are just as important, and that we can very easily learn to manage a society in which we think about all those things. And that this is just the level of complexity, the sort of the level we've graduated to just demands this of us. Shit's going to get a little harder. So what? We can handle this. Every business person handles this. Every person handles this in their lives. And so this is that transition moment, I believe.
I mean, you actively experimented with rethinking value by turning Kickstarter into a public benefit corporation, a PBC as it's known in the US. What made this different from other Silicon Valley companies, and what did you learn from the process of actually going through turning this large organization into a public benefit corporation?
Well, we've always been purpose driven. Like we'd always said from the beginning, we don't want to sell out. We don't want to try to go public. Like the Kickstarter success is it being meaningful to the creative community over the long term. And so that, that was always there. But as a for-profit company, the legal expectation is that we would be maximizing shareholder value. And as our lawyer would remind us from time to time, the fact that we spoke so loudly about the fact that we didn't do that put us at some theoretical risk. And in fact, if Kickstarter survived to such a day that, say, us as co-founders are no longer alive and someone else is running the company, then the company can be however shitty that person wants it to be. There's nothing actually limiting them from doing that. And in fact, the shareholders at that point in time could say, hey, you must fire everybody and maximize profits right now. And so to protect ourselves from that, we really needed to put ourselves in a category that truly represented who and what we are. And so this is when we learned of the public benefit corporation designation, which just happened in 2013. We learned about it after Patagonia made this change. And, I was CEO when we made this shift. And our charter includes like 12 to 15 different provisions, some of which are specific to the business. There's one section that was just like, let's imagine a code of conduct for like a good business. Let's imagine like Goldman Sachs could follow this. And that's included things like a pledge that the company would never use legal but esoteric tax avoidance strategies, that the company would never lobby for public policies that benefited the corporation but not our end users, that the company would never try to claim legal rights from its users that it didn't actually need to operate its business. And all these sorts of ways, that's just like, what is the fair thing to do? Like, we know that the law is absolutely tilted in the favor of corporations. We know that we could take advantage in all these sorts of ways. What is the way that you sort of lay down that sword and say we're coming to you as as an honest person? So there's a lot of things like that, pledging after-tax profits to arts and music education. What I didn't know at the time was how practically, how much will this actually change things on a practical level? And what I found is that it actually had quite a material impact. These were values that we'd cared about, the way that we thought about things, but in the past they were maybe like guardrails that you would bump into if you got a little astray. But instead, as a PBC, when they were like in a charter of our legally held responsibilities, they felt more like things I was compelled to do, that we must do on a daily basis. It's not just like, don't break this. It's like actually like express this, manifest this. And so the way that we thought about our responsibilities as a company changed. We became much more activist. We'd always been activisty, became even more so. We did things like create the Creative Independent, which is a completely non-revenue producing project, but that elevates the voice of creative people. And just try to sort of live up to this larger value set and try to imagine our responsibility in a bigger way. And to me, Kickstarter has seen nothing but benefit from that. Nothing but benefit from that. It's a strong signal that you're not a Silicon Valley company to the market for the people that it's most important to Kickstarter, the creator community, the backer community. It lets those people know that we're not trying to like get rich on their backs. Like kind of who you're dealing with here. And my personal belief is that there's about 5,000 PBCs in America at this point, I believe. I don't know that the PBC model itself is going to grow, but I think the PBC mindset and expectations are going to do a reverse takeover of C Corps. I think eventually every company in America is going to function in this way. It's going to happen from market pressure. It's going to happen from to try to appeal to a certain workforce, to a certain clientele and customer base. But I think there is a race to the top that's happening there. That is going to put these sorts of non-financial responsibilities, non-financial values, more and more into the hands of corporations in a way that is going to kind of be what people have been agitating for, like capitalism to take more responsibility on the one hand. On the other hand, it might end up resulting in companies having even more power, which is why, say, the bailouts, the stimuluses that have been happening here in the U.S., jobs are being destroyed by the millions, stocks are going up by the billions. And it's because the changes that are happening now are just simply reinforcing that same power structure. companies are getting stronger and stronger and stronger. Like that's the macro game of this era, of the Trump era. It's just companies are getting stronger. The state and other institutions are getting weaker. That is why the stock market goes up. And so, yeah, companies are going to be taking on more and more of that responsibility. It's going to get weird. We might get to like Procter and Gamble sponsoring housewives around the world and like paying them a UBI, like to be ambassadors, right? Like I can imagine a world where companies are providing UBIs to their most loyal customers as a way to create, brand power. I think the level of weirdness that we're going to head to in terms of who steps up, especially when states fail to step up on these new frontier values, is really going to reorient how we think about responsibility. I think it's going to get strange.
Do you really think the UBI, or universal basic income, is a solution, or does that just feel like another byproduct of financial maximization? Or would it be better to talk about things like universal basic services instead of universal basic income? Does it matter about how we receive that universal basic thing?
Yeah, I mean, my instinct has been to think that the notion of the UBI is like very much a solution of this financial maximization age, where the answer to a problem is just to give away money. It's just like it's like when the whole world is honey, the answer is honey, right? So I think there's a little bit of it's a reflection of this time. I think of it as like, can we guarantee everyone's now me? Can we guarantee everyone the bottom two rungs of Maslow's hierarchy? I think most society, European societies tend to do that. You provide for physical safety through laws and police. I mean, that's in every society. In Europe, you also provide healthcare, so you provide for that kind of physical safety. But I think that, like, to me, it's more that how can we answer people's now me needs in a way that people can lift their sights higher, where people can think more about a purpose in life, can think more about their obligations to each other, can think more about the world their children are going to step into. And I do think that's hard if those bottom rungs of your Maslow's hierarchy are empty, right? It's hard to move forward beyond that. So I understand UBI as like, how do we guarantee that kind of security to everybody? And I get the simplicity of that. My instinct is that the answer is more like services than cash. But I root for everyone. I root for a solution.
No,
of any kind.
The funny thing is, in the book, we have these models for corporations, PBCs, in the case of Kickstarter. But in the book, and you keep mentioning that phrase, future me, but in the book, you actually look at models for individuals, how individuals can change their value set. And oddly enough, the way in which you can change your value set is tied to Japanese lunch. It's called Bentoism. Could you explain what Bentoism is and how that changes our relationship with things like the future me and the now me?
Yeah, so I was like pulling on this thread of our self-interest being too limited. Like we think of our self-interest as like this game theory, now me, that's all that really matters. And one day in my notebook, I was doodling and I drew like a hockey stick graph, a chart of a line going up and to the right. And, where whatever your self-interest is, something like this, whatever your self-interest is, it's growing so fast, the line goes up and to the right. And I suddenly was looking at this and had this thought of like, don't both these axes on this graph keep going? Like the x-axis measuring time, it extends far out from now into the future. And the y-axis measuring your self-interest, money, power, fame, whatever, it also keeps growing. And I thought as our self-interest grows, it grows in its dimensionality. It goes from me to us. The more self-interest you have, the more responsibility you have. Like the difference between being single and having a family is huge, or being a worker or being an entrepreneur is huge. And so suddenly this like little graph of a hockey stick graph was suddenly with this much bigger space. And I drew boxes around it and created a very simple 2x2 chart. And I thought this is actually a more true map of self-interest, where And that space where there's the hockey stick graph, that space is now me, what I want and need right now. This is how we think of self-interest today. But in the bottom right corner of this 2x2 is future me, the older, wiser version of myself, the Obi-Wan Kenobi version of me that looks back through time and tells me what matters, helps me make the right choice. In the top left, there's now us. My family, my friends, whatever my responsibilities are, those people. And in the top right corner is future us, my kids or everybody else's kids. And I thought, as I looked at this, I thought, wow, every choice I make leaves a footprint in each of these spaces. Now me, now us, future us. But yet I'm blind to everything but now me. Like, I know that the future matters. I know that, like, other people in my life matter. But I really have a hard time conceptually holding on to those things. And here seemed to be an expression of like what was actually going on in my head. And so after I drew this chart, I wrote, what is this a graph of? And I just wrote a description. I wrote beyond near-term orientation. I thought this is a graph to help me see beyond my near-term orientation. And then I suddenly looked at that and realized it was an acronym for Bento. And I thought about the Japanese bento box. And the bento box has 4 compartments and a lid. It derives from a word meaning convenience. And the beauty of the bento is that because of its compartments, it lets you hold a variety of dishes, not too much of any one thing. So it's always a balanced meal. And the bento also honors a Japanese dieting philosophy called hara hachi bu, which says the goal of a meal is to be 80% full. That way you're still hungry for tomorrow. So I thought, what I've drawn here, it's a bento for my choices and my self-interest. It's a way for me to not just gorge myself on now me, but for me to really keep in mind the now us of my family, my responsibilities to other people, my future me, who I really want to become in life, my ultimate potential, and then future us, like what's the world that's going to be left after I'm gone. And so this has become a way that I make choices. It's a way that I identify my priorities. It's a way that I teach workshops to help people find their values. It's a way that I advise CEOs and companies and help them build their bentos. So like there are companies that the people that work there have the bento as a compass, where everyone's sort of making choices according to the same perspective of what matters, what the larger picture is. But it's simply a way to expand our awareness beyond just this now me space, and to allow us to see the full impact of choices. And the need for this is so acute, because when we only see now me, then decisions that maybe sacrifice the near term for a longer term benefit, those look like bad options. Or choices that are good for us now but are bad for us in the long term, those look like good options. Right? When we don't see the whole picture, we tell ourselves we're making good choices, but really we're committing acts of self-harm. And so I think that this expansion of perspective, whether the bento language is what ultimately sticks or not, I believe this expansion of perspective is what's happening right now with COVID-19 for sure. The future, the us, the collective spaces are much more clear. And I think that this is a kind of a map for how we might imagine post-capitalist values working, for how we might imagine our shared responsibilities working, and how we might imagine new spaces of opportunity working. So, for example, I think that there could be companies that serve the future us space. There could be a certain type of entrepreneur who works on future me or now us kinds of problems. I believe that this is a map of whole new frontiers of ways to provide value to each other, and a way to work towards this larger goal of not just maximizing now me financial value, but to pursue coherence, to pursue choices that are really in line with all these spaces, and show that greater awareness.
I guess it's one thing to aspire towards having a better relationship with your future self, but it's really hard to do that, isn't it? It's really hard to act in a way to make that happen. And I guess, how do we keep ourselves accountable to our future selves?
I think it's practice. I use what are basically like method acting techniques, where I will try to step into those roles. Even the choice I made to write this book, I used something like that, where I used a process to come up with 5 different possible career paths as a next step, and then spent a day pretending I was each one of those things, and allowed that day of like pretending I was a teacher, pretending I was a journalist, pretending I was like making some video project, allowed that experience to tell me what was right or wrong for me. And so for me, like stepping into my future me space, stepping into all these spaces is something I do on a weekly basis. So I have like a weekly practice where I basically journal and try to step into these spaces, picture my now us, picture my future me, which I really do picture Obi-Wan. I really do picture like the hologram Obi-Wan. And I try to be quiet and almost meditate with those spaces. And just they tell me what's important. Like my now us, I'll reflect, okay, now us, what do you say matters? And my now us will say, hey, you and your wife haven't had like a date time together in a week, like plan something, or call these friends, or, think of this way that you could be more giving. And these are things that my system one thinking brain, my passive reactive brain isn't thinking about. That part of my mind is just thinking like self-promote, whatever, go get what's mine, just selfish shit, like very, very selfish stuff. And so I just get used to engaging with these things. And now these voices are more natural to me. This coming week, this Sunday, I'm going to start hosting a weekly Bento session where people are going to join. It will be 20 minutes long, and it will simply be, the first 10 minutes will be everyone going through a silent exercise where I will help them see and feel each of those spaces for themselves. And then the second 10 minutes is they will journal at each of those voices and sort of let those voices say, here's what we should do this week. Here's what matters over the next 7 days. And every week we're simply going to do that. And each week we're going to add a new layer to making these parts of ourselves more real to us, more experiments to try to like get a better handle on the voices that are already inside of us. And then again, to get practice with making choices and shaping our time with those things fully in mind. I have found it to be extremely simple and like greatly beneficial. Like I will default to selfish now me thinking. I don't want to. I aspire to more than that. I don't always do that. But it's hard to not always do, the moments where it's hard to not do that. And so to me, something like the Bento framework is like a mental scaffolding. It's like a tool of love that's just saying, hey, here's the stuff that's hard to keep in mind, but is extremely important. And here's just a way to force you to do that. Here's a muscle memory. And also here is possibly a map towards greater meaning, greater coherence in your life, greater opportunity. Here's what's to look for beyond the now me of survival. And so it's something I've taught to probably 1,000 people in workshops to date. And it's tremendous. It's tremendous because it's not enforcing any value system on you whatsoever. It's simply making you aware of what you actually think. And that's meaningful because when you know what you actually think, then you can act according to what you actually believe, and your choices likely change.
So we're going to start taking questions from the YouTube audience. So if you have a question for Yancey, please put it into the YouTube live chat that's running just along the side of this YouTube video. Yancey, it would be irresponsible of me not to mention the elephant in the room, which is the current crisis. And I just wonder how COVID-19 is changing our ways in which we're acting. Are you seeing more people acting for now me, or are you hopeful that we're going to start acting for things like future us?
Yeah, this is a total now us, future us space. Yeah. I think, I mentioned I do that weekly Bento process. The first time I did it after the quarantine, the lockdown started, normally when I do my Bento, I start with now me because that's the thing that's the most obvious to me. But that week, when I looked at Now Me, I had no idea. What did I want? I had no clue. But when I saw Now Us, I instantly knew. I have a 4-year-old. I'm a homeschool teacher for half a day now. I instantly know. Oh, Now Us. Like I know absolutely what my responsibilities are. And in that moment, I realized, whoa, my entire orientation has shifted. Right? I'm very us oriented now. I'm only as safe as my neighbor and my neighbor's neighbor. And suddenly it's like I see the world very differently. I think that's likely to stay for a while. There is the weird thing of the hyper isolation that kind of balances that out. But I feel like the fact that we exist beyond now me, that the future is real and coming. We could see that as we see like we're 10 days behind Italy sort of ideas, as the crisis was first happening. But we can also just sort of see that collective space, especially here in the US where we provide very few collective services. The lack of healthcare is going to be more and more of an issue. The best thing that's happening out of it, I think the global pause is fantastic in many ways, but I'm excited by like the internet, the network, really stepping into its own even more, and that there's a kind of a collective consciousness that has been becoming gradually digitized, but is now becoming much more alive, to where so many minds are collaborating on the same problem set. We're using this tool to bring ourselves together. And I think that the benefits that we will see as a result of that are just going to be enormous. It's long been my theory that like the post-internet innovation won't be like AR or AI or whatever, another technological revolution. I think the revolution after the internet is consciousness, is human consciousness, is the networked organism of all of us. And I don't mean that in a singularity kind of way, but just that we're kind of all neurons responding collectively to this crisis. Like the COVID-19, some parts of our body felt it first and tried to warn the rest of the body. And then the collective consciousness spits out flatten the curve as like the paradigm to help us understand what needs to happen. And then that rapidly gets dispersed throughout the entire brain. All of that to me is just like outrageous. It's kind of outrageous. And so I feel a sense of awe at that. And believe in that, and believe in its power, and I can imagine a universe, say, where Donald Trump is not the president of the United States, where this is like the scientific Olympics of like the entire world coming together. This amazing moment of cohesion, and that moment is like 100% could be here. That's what's supposed to happen now. That's what's supposed to happen. Right?
That's what's supposed to happen.
Yeah.
Supposed to.
Exactly.
Following that macro idea a little further, do you think COVID-19 might actually expedite some of the changes that you're advocating for in the book? You put a 30-year time horizon on most of the changes that you expect to see in the book, but do you think, in fact, COVID-19 could speed that up, or do you think it's actually going to slow that down? Do you think that 30-year horizon is going to now turn into a 50-year horizon? What do you think has been the impact of COVID-19 on sort of some of your dreams for what you see as the post-financial maximization future?
I think in the near term, the strong get stronger and the weak get weaker. I think that's going to keep happening. But I think that will produce its own larger break, this own larger breakdown. I believe in a 30-year theory of change. That's like a generational theory of change, and kind of at the heart of like why do generational changes happen is death. I think that people change their minds less often than people die, and people grew up in a new reality with a new set of cultural norms, and so that we can imagine the median line of opinion kind of changing as certain people die and certain people are born, and so I think waves of mass death will be accelerants of change in opinion, in a very brutal kind of way. I don't expect there to be an immediate bounce back towards virtuousness. Maybe in some of these well-being societies, maybe that happens. But I would expect things to get darker in the near term. But yes, I believe that we are going to discover that there are other value sets that can orient our machines, and that we're going to need those, right? Because the other significant transformation that's happening now will be from human labor to computer labor to AI to things like that. The challenge for a human organization It's not knowing where you want to go. It's getting a bunch of human beings to get there together and to battling the daily distractions. For an AI system, there will be none of those human distractions. And in fact, whatever metric or target that we set, it theoretically will be able to get there in some way or another. So the question is, what are those metrics that we're setting? What are those targets? How are they being informed? How are we thinking about like the light and the shadow of each of those things? And so to me, the importance of metrics, the importance of defining the values that we want to be optimizing for, that we want to prioritize, I think it's just going to become more and more important because they're going to be meaningfully running our institutions and our systems. And if we allow those systems to operate according to the value sets that we run today, then we're going to have systems that optimize for money, power, and attention. That's going to be the big three, right? There's not going to be anything else that's going to have room for that. And so I think that's like I look at that as the kind of leverage point. I mean, I love the Danilo Meadows essay about the points of leverage in a system, and it's like the values layer is what other things are built upon. And so I think that all those things do get put more on the table in a post-COVID world. That this is climate change fast forward. That there's a lot of that. The fact that this is teaching us that it's possible for us to pause the world and to totally change things, and that. Yes, the world ends in some ways, but also the world is kind of better in other ways. And it's a great dry run, and a great reminder of the tenuousness of what's here. I say all that while fearing it, and not taking it lightly by any stretch. All this may be adding up to a kind of awe I feel. At the ability of this tiny thing, to so greatly affect us.
We have a question from YouTube from Ian Forrester, who's asked you, Yancey, what's your dream post-capitalism for humankind?
To me, it's a dream where everyone is able to. I keep coming to this idea of coherence, but I feel like the challenge of the modern world is that we end up self-compromising a lot to provide financial stability for ourselves. And that systems on a macro level create a lot of instability and a lot of corruption to try to maximize for their own financial self-interest. The world I imagine is one where we simply see financial value as a tool that's used to exchange for other values. The idea that the richest person on the street is like the happiest person on the street, that's a move that we abandon, that we imagine that the most well-off person is the one who's most balanced, the one who has their head on their shoulders, the one who maybe has the middle-class job and they don't have to work so much, they get to spend time with their family. I think that there's a different notion of what it means to be a successful human being that happens. And I think that I would love to see, in the same way we're seeing humanity's talents come together around health, I would love to see our talents come together around solving all other problems like loneliness, like how we feel socially connected, like what it means to be a human being through the internet, like the fairness of systems. I think that there's going to be I think the most important metrics and measurements for shaping the future haven't yet been invented. And that's the process of the next 10, 20 years. I think that Adele example is the utopian version. I think the China's social credit system is the dystopian version. And I think we're going to see more of both.
We have another question from Nico on YouTube. And Nico, apologies if I've misunderstood your question, but I guess what Nico's trying to say is what happens to those who feel, I guess, trapped by their material circumstances. So it's all very well and good to talk about, let's move towards a post-financial future and change and have new value sets. But what about people who are living paycheck to paycheck, whereby all they're thinking about is their ability to survive financially? How realistically do they live with this new value set?
I think that many cases, they may do a better job than a wealthy person. Because if your now me is hard, yes, it's more difficult to operate in those other spaces. But I think that, say, if you look at religious rates, how they relate to income level. Generally, the less money you have, the more religious you tend to be. And I would say that for someone whose now me is harder, is a more challenging space, then you have to lean on the now us of your community of your church, your family. You also have to think about the future me of salvation and the afterlife to give your life purpose and meaning, right? If your day-to-day is hard, then what is the purpose of that day-to-day? Well, there is this larger goal of trying to live a worthy life. I think for someone who's extremely wealthy, the challenges with materialism are of one of materialistic abundance that can cause you to lose sight of your obligations to other people. That can cause loneliness. That can create a separateness from society. So I think too much or too little can ironically have a similar kind of outcome. So I would say that maybe the wealthier person has more time. Maybe that's the one thing that can be said. But if you look at like religious doctrine, if you look at the Bible, Jesus would say that it's easier it's easier to pass through the needle of a camel, the eye of a needle than it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to go into heaven, right? The notion that wealth is something that blocks you from sort of that liberation, blocks you from your greatest potential. Again, we're in a world today where that incentive layer of money rules the show. So we think that having that money is nirvana, right? We automatically assume that people have what they need, and that people that don't have that don't have what they need. And I would argue that really that's just like one of probably 5 or 6 things that you need. And yes, it can make other stuff, it can balance other things out. But I don't think that's the answer on its own. So I think the ability to self-actualize, the ability to be more coherent, I think that might have an inverse relationship to wealth. I mean, monks are impoverished for a reason, right? So I think that we're maybe a little bit trapped in the orthodoxy of today and assuming who this may be valuable for.
And another question that follows on from the idea of the orthodoxy of today is from James Poxon on YouTube, who asks, in what way do you feel that cultures are built on historical precedent? And really the core of his question is, do you see any preferable value systems from our past that perhaps that we should re-embrace that allows you to achieve some of the things that you're talking about, either from the past or from other cultures?
Yeah, totally. I love that question because I think that we are kind of running on a 17th through 18th century playbook of values and utilitarianism, and it's amazing how deeply that stuff runs. When I was doing a lot of research, the movement that became really fascinating to me was called communitarianism, and this first was around when the United States was first beginning. And I'm going to butcher some of this. It's been a while since it's been a couple of years since I read all this, but communitarianism was really based on values pluralism, and that you could have a society where, education would be run by educational values, health by health values, and everything would be run according to its native script, and that orienting a society around that way wouldn't be utopia, but would create the best potential of outcomes. And so people end up experimenting with this. And interestingly, one of the most important thinkers in game theory, John Nash, who created Prisoner's Dilemma, he ended up moving to a communitarian community in the 1970s. This is how I ended up finding out about this movement. But there's a book I read called Spheres of Justice, which had a tremendous effect on me, which argues that the form of all injustice in the world is when a value system rules beyond its rightful domain. So the most classic example is Galileo being asked to refute the laws of science because the values of the church were more powerful at that time. So that's a form of injustice, and really all injustice in the world is rooted in that kind of idea. This book was written by Michael Walzer, and so the notion of trying to find the right lens of value, kind of finding that match between what is the situation, what is the value at stake, and then acting rather than always assuming there's a singular value at stake. That's kind of like the philosophical underpinning by a whole line of thinking. And so that originated from this notion of values pluralism, that values are expressive, they are rational in the eye of their beholder, and that a society could actually flourish if you allowed everyone to act according to their value system. That we maybe imagine that as some like discordant values orgy. But in reality, it's probably more like a rainforest. It's probably more like an ecosystem that would emerge if we just allowed people to live truly to their value systems.
We have another question from YouTube, this time from Kate Hammer, and she's asking, what do you think matters most that also evades measurement? So it's great to talk about these new value systems, but if we can't measure that, how do we even identify it as a value?
Yeah. I mean, I think that that is going to be, kind of the way I come at metrics and measurement being so important is not that I want that to happen. Like the idea that measuring things removes the love and magic from them. Like I emotionally buy into that. But if I think about automated systems and the kind of information they will require to operate, then I think like the idea that we shouldn't be in the metric game because we think it's like it's not indie enough. I just can't. That's hard for me to stomach because I think the influence of these things is going to be so strong. But what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to find signals that approximate these different kind of metrics. We can look at examples of how industries change as a result of new metrics being added. So if you think about food where, say, calories are being forced to be displayed, we've put ourselves into this interesting dual metric decision-making process of price and calories together that I still think we don't know quite the language of how to do that. But here we see this shift from like a monolithic value system to now sort of something more like a values pluralistic system. You can even see it in sports where, say, like data analysis has been used to completely re-engineer how teams play because they've shown that previous strategies produce less desired outcomes than different kinds of strategies. So I think that if I imagine how these new kinds of values might be accepted, it's not from every CEO getting woke in the same way. It is from these values being rationally expressed. It is from these being demonstrated as producing better outcomes that we all agree upon. Because that's the world where you get someone who disagrees with this politically to actually take this up and apply this in their business. Because like if we're just trying to speak on this like cultural value woke space, you're only going to talk to the choir. Like the importance of this, the meaning of this, the goal of this should be that this is not the new indie hit that lets people feel superior to another group of people. But no, this is the fucking mainstream. This is the game. This is what success is. This is obvious. And so how do you work to that reality? And to me, that's where you get to like global scale of change. And it seems to me that anything less than that is like, what are we even doing here in terms of shooting for a goal?
I want to ask you another question about our current state and the pandemic that we're dealing with. A lot of people will look to you and look to Kickstarter as freelancers and as creatives, and those were largely the groups of individuals that you were supporting: musicians, creatives, freelancers. I mean, what is your advice, Yancey, for those sorts of individuals during this very difficult time?
Cut costs. I mean, it's just you got to live as light as you can. I think that. I mean, I have my own versions of these things, right? Where, I had a compartmentalization of life, of having a child, having a work self, all these other selves. Now they're all just piled on top of each other. It's just cacophony. And trying to pull out my now me, my future me, the part of me that's creative, that's working on projects, getting that person to focus has been difficult. To do that, I ended up doing an exercise to step into my future me self, where I imagined, okay, it's a year and a half from now. The last of the lockdowns is over. The vaccine's done. We're out. Let's imagine you feel especially proud of what you did during that time. Well, then what did you do? What are those 3 things that you did? And And when I went through that process, in addition to my family obligations, I focused in on completing a single long-term project. That the idea that I would just be grinding on something sort of bit by bit each day, that I thought that would be the right kind of creative output for me. But so knowing that means like I have to change the cost structure of my life. I have to sort of have this thought of what if income is not anything like what I expect it to be for the next year. And then to give myself meaning, to let myself still feel motivated, I'm trying to set this target of like a project that I'm completing bit by bit along the way. People are going to launch Kickstarters, Patreons, things like that to make up the gaps in their, the economic gaps that they face. Some of those will do well. I think some will be harder because not a lot of people feel that secure right now. So it's really, really tough. But I think it's, just controlling costs, extending your runway. I mean, it's the same for a business, and really put yourself in a mindset. I put myself in a mindset of, okay, we're in this position for a year and a half, 2 years. If that's the case, how do I need to think about my time differently? And I just reassessed.
I guess my final question then is for us as audience members, listening to everything that you've just said, how do we become active advocates for this new way of thinking about value? What must we do as individuals, I guess, to force a change to the political economy? What's your best advice for individuals on the ground?
Well, I think it does start with individuals becoming more aware, developing that active awareness, having this kind of language of a dimensionality of self-interest, sort of not viewing the economic choice as always being the right choice, being able to voice that in a meeting, being able to gradually shift the culture of your company in that kind of way. I believe that there is a groundswell in a direction it's against the excesses of capital, right? There's sort of an anti-groundswell that's happening that I think will only grow. I think the fuse has been lit, and what we're going through right now is just going to only exacerbate it. But the question is, what do we step into? If not what we have now, then what? And how can we have a vision that's not destructive? And so to me, the constructive vision is we're owning the spaces where we have impact. We're owning our future impact. We're trying to be very conscious of how we affect one another. And we're doing that in our personal lives. We're doing that in our organizations. And if this kind of language comes to be accepted, if the future is come to be seen as rational, as if the collective and the us is come to be seen as just as real as the me, then I think that the kinds of choices and the values that we'll make, that we'll prioritize, are just going to change from that. So I think that for now, it is just becoming comfortable with these as real spaces that exist. I think 30 years from now, everything I'm saying now is going to be like so basic and boring, it's going to seem absurd that anyone had to explain it. I firmly believe that's going to happen. And it just comes from just being comfortable. And I could just say for myself, having done this for two years now, it's had a meaningful impact on how I think about myself and my space in the world. And the weekly experience that I mentioned, if you just go to bit.ly/weekly bento, you can sign up. First one's going to be this Sunday. It's going to be, we'll see how many people, but it's just very, very chill, and just trying to give you that space to become more aware. And I realized that when we're talking about the kinds of macro challenges that we're talking about, like all this sounds very, very small, and it may be in the larger scheme. But this is how things begin. This is how things grow. And I saw it with Kickstarter. You look at anything through history. This is how things happen. There isn't the spontaneous combustion where there's like the big bang of wokeness and everyone just wakes up and believes the opposite of what they believed the day before. It's not going to happen that way. And so I think we need a credible path that owns what's good about the present, that yes-ands it, builds on top of it, and that isn't just preaching to the choir. And to me, that future looks something like this.
So on that note, I want to thank you, Yancey, for joining us for one of our very first Futures Podcast live stream events. I also want to thank the University of Warwick's Ian O'Donoghue for providing the technology to make this live stream possible. Please subscribe to this YouTube account to be alerted to future episodes and events. And if you like what you've heard, then you can download the Futures podcast on your favorite podcasting app. Or you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at Futures Podcast. More episodes, events, transcripts, and show notes can be found at futurespodcast.net. Yancey's book is now available. I want to thank you for listening to the Futures Podcast. And again, thank Yancey for taking the time to join us today. Thank you, Yancey.
Thank you so much.
Cheers, man.